Welcome, everyone. It's another Friday, and so it's a Friday in January, and so it's time for a Friday Forum. My name is Cyndy McDonald. I'm glad to be your hostess for these Friday Forums. We cover topics on education and business and things that are important to you. So I'm very privileged to be able to invite experts in these fields that can share thoughts and have conversations about these topics. As you come in, please put in your name and where you're located, and also just put in the chat what organization you're affiliated with. If you're with a private organization, a business, a school, that way John can see where all of my audience is coming from. We're so pleased today to have John Burdick. He is the Vice Provost for Enrollment at Cornell University, but as he was saying, he's also transplanted Californian and gone from one coast to the other. We're so glad to have you here today, John.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk with people about this very important and urgent topic in some ways. So thank you for the opportunity.
It is something we all have on our mind, and we're really wondering, what the Supreme Court's going to do and how that's going to impact the students that we all work with. And we're all working with students across the globe. And I know that parents are having these conversations and students are having these conversations, and we're really uncertain as to what implications might be. And I think those conversations too are more general for higher education. The implications are much more global for higher education as well. So we also have Carmen with us today. So Carmen is back and she'll be managing the chat and the questions. Carmen's back at, I was going to say Phillips, I don't know why, Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, kind of across the river from New York. So John, as we're getting started, can you just share a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into higher education, what drew you to this?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I grew up in suburban San Diego County, California, and was a low-income first-generation student, so I was looking for the best college, especially scholarship opportunities I could get. That drew me ultimately to USC, University of Southern California in downtown Los Angeles, and that was probably the first place because I was coming from a relatively conservative white part of San Diego County, La Mesa, Grossmont area, and I came into downtown LA, and what even then at USC was a deliberately assembled diverse community with people from many, many more backgrounds and walks of life than I'd ever encountered before or would have had any ability to encounter. And that was important for me. It just felt like it really opened my eyes and gave me access to things that I wouldn't have had any other way. I had never traveled much or anything. So that in my roommates and my people down the hall and the people I got to know, it was a really eye-opening experience and wonderful. As I was doing that, I got very involved at USC, and the vice president for student affairs said, you ought to consider higher education as a career. And ultimately that proved prophetic. So I went straight into work at USC along with my master's work and worked there for 18 years. People thought I was a lifer who was never going to leave USC, and anybody who knows USC and the Trojans knows how involving that can be between football and everything else. But then I was the associate dean of admissions in what is now the Dornsife College, and didn't have much prospect of ever being a dean or a leader because the person who was there was going to be there for a long time. And I got lured away with the offer of a job opportunity at the senior level as Dean of Admission Financial Aid at the University of Rochester in upstate New York. I was warned by people it's cold and cloudy, and I said, I kind of figured that out. I did take some geography. I actually loved Rochester, still love Rochester, and we were able to assemble a very deliberate and diverse community on that campus, which is between 5,500 and 6,000 students, and was a wonderful, another research university with a huge medical apparatus, but different from USC, obviously in a lot of ways, in a smaller city. And then almost 4 years ago now, I was presented with the opportunity to consider coming to Cornell, which is as big and complicated in some ways as USC, but in the same location in beautiful Ithaca in New York, just a couple hours away from Rochester. So I was able to keep my friends and community there, but come to work at this tremendous, powerful $5 billion a year operation that's an Ivy League research university, but also tries to sustain some of the things about private education and the student experience that matter to me a great deal. So, and my role here is Vice Provost for Enrollment, which means in addition to admissions and undergraduate admissions and financial aid, which I've now had for a long time in 2 places, I have graduate admissions, professional admissions, and the registrar functions and activities. So I get to engage with almost everywhere around campus and our campuses in New York City. So it's an exciting job. Half of it has been pandemic, which anybody who changed jobs in 2019 or early 2020 probably understands how I feel. It's like I got to know the place and then boom, it all changed. But I'm enjoying it very much.
And you're working on the Cornell has all the different colleges and all these different basically moving parts. And what's part of your mission is to do what with that?
So I'm the first vice provost for enrollment they've had, and the point is to bring all these disparate offices and their needs under one umbrella, especially with respect to systems and policies and practices and training for professional staff. A lot of things that Cornell's like a bunch of summer camps ranged around the lake, kind of in terms of its structure. And we're not trying to change that. We get a lot of advantage of that because engineering does engineering things and arts does arts things. But we do want to reap the benefits of what coordination and, dare I say it, centralization can achieve for us. So we're making progress on all of that.
Well, that's exciting. That's very, and it's always so exciting to be part of that change and have that vision and, you know, here's what you can be and here are the steps that we need to take to make it there, right?
Yeah, and it's a really fun place. I mean, just the students that come here are amazing. The faculty are extraordinary. It's just it's an incredible journey.
Well, I have, amazingly enough, I've never visited Cornell. So,
well, this is your ticket. You invite me on your show. You come to, yeah.
All right, I'll take you up on that.
Anyone in the audience, you invite me to your house, you get invited to mine at some point. We'll make it tit for tat.
Well, thank you. So let's talk about the Supreme Court case. What's some of the historical background? There have been previous cases. There was one with recently with Harvard and University of North Carolina. So what are some of the historical background for this?
Well, you know, way back in the 1970s with Bakke versus the University of California at Davis, which was about medical education but had broader implications. That was the first place, and it's funny because that's, almost 50 years ago now, but people don't really entirely get this. The Supreme Court sort of dismissed out of the hand the idea that college admission could compensate for 350 years of history that sort of had driven us societally one way or the other on terms of race and ethnic background. And so that's not really what's going on. And all the subsequent cases have been on the top of that case, where the real rationale for embracing diversity on campuses like mine and many of ours that we want is that that's an improved educational experience. It's better for people to encounter people who think differently, who have different ideas, who come from different backgrounds, different perspectives to offer. That's really an essential part of good education. And even more, I think it's an essential part of doing good work. A project team of people who all come from the same background and tend to think about the same problems in the same way isn't going to come up with creative, innovative solutions as fast as one where people are asking questions from different perspectives. And so there's a lot of good reasons for campuses to be really focused on diversity for all of its fields, for its STEM fields, and for all of the other things that it does as part of doing great work on great problems and learning for students together. There have been powerful advocates. So the next round of cases that came up of consequence was in 2003. University of Michigan, both the law school and the College of Arts and Sciences had systems whereby they increased diversity and representations. In their case, particularly, there was anxious to sort of keep a population of African Americans in the state of Michigan, which has a large African American population, and they were trying to keep that a focal point at this very elite institution. And that was an interesting case because the court split. They said what the law school is doing with this very holistic review is okay. What the undergraduate college at that time is doing, which was more of a point-based system with attaching specific points to specific students based on their identity, their racial identity, that was not okay. And that's where they came up with a philosophy that's really been with us forever since. So almost 20 years now, we've been operating on the basis that You can use race as a part of your evaluation process and admission as long as you've explored the use of race-neutral alternatives. You considered all the ways that you might get the diversity you want without using race explicitly in your review, and that you've narrowly tailored the way that you use race in your process. So you're not just attaching points to it automatically. You're not doing an automatic admission waive based on a checkbox. And so college admissions operations have been doing this now for almost 20 years. They've been pursuing active race-neutral alternatives to try to create diverse campuses. For a lot of reasons, that has not been enough for most of us. In California out there, in the UC system, in the Cal States, and in other places, Michigan included now, there have been some states that have been, by their own constitutional processes, required not to use race in their evaluation process. So they've been doing this already. And I have to say the record's pretty mixed. I hear occasionally a sort of a representation that, well, California, in 1996, I think, when the Prop 209 came into being, that they suffered at first. There was a big drop off in the representations from certain racial subgroups for a while, but then they recovered. But I think that's overstated. There was a partial recovery across both the big UC and the Cal State systems. There was generally continuing growth in African American Latino college going rates, and not too much of a drop off in attainment, but not keeping up with the population. But if you look at places that I'd consider comparable to Cornell in their selectivity and the academic processes they put together, I don't think UCLA or Berkeley could say that they've come back to the same levels that they had in terms of diversity and welcoming many voices as they had 25 years ago. So there's some real consequences for these laws and activities going into place. And so when the Supreme Court, and I'll call it, I think it's fair to say whether you agree with what they're doing or not, and frankly, a majority of the American public does kind of agree with it, they've taken an activist role, because both the UNC and the Harvard cases were decided in favor of the universities, that they were not practicing racially exclusive processes that unfairly burdened, in this case, Asian Americans in the process, and limited their access to those very prestigious places. Basically, lower courts and appellate courts with voluminous documentation of decisions and said, no, Harvard's doing this right, UNC's doing this right, or they're both doing it right enough. There isn't really a standing for the plaintiffs to say that they have done it wrong. But then the Supreme Court said, nope, we're going to take another look. We're going to put these cases together. They heard oral arguments on October 31st. Even before the oral arguments, and certainly since, there's been a lot of expectation that a court, which I'll say has a conservative majority, either 5 or 6 members of that court seem most likely to move forward more aggressively in prohibiting the use of race in explicit ways as part of the college admission review process and this is important, for any place that takes federal funds. So there might be 1 or 2 places in the United States that don't take any federal funds that would be exempt from this, but Cornell's not. We get, close to $1 billion in research funding and financial aid. So whatever that court decision is in June is likely to impact us as much as any state institution. And it does seem, just being realistic, it does seem like it's going to go one way. It's going to be the case that our freedoms to use this information in our admission process is substantially changed. We don't know yet how substantially. Is it going to be simply you can't really use the box that's been checked as a part of your understanding of who that student is, but other information that guides you to understand their history and background is still okay? That would be the lightest sort of touch. The most extreme touch is you can't even engage for admissions purposes with high schools and community-based organizations that themselves have racial identity at the center of their work. So an organization that was specifically created, for instance, to support children of migrant farm workers in the Central Valley in California, that was clearly and obviously and heavily oriented towards supporting Latino and Latina students, might not be something that Cornell is allowed to engage with the deliberate intent of enrolling students that come through that background and that pipeline. That would be the most extreme version of what might happen in late June or early July. At least that's when we think the court's decision will be announced.
Wow, that's the big key, is what is that range of continuum? It could be just not having the box to check on the application, or all these other aspects. Would they get down to those very specific things and say you can or can't do this?
I'd say that's a 50-50 chance. Mostly based on what we heard in the oral arguments, we're guessing not. It seemed like they were focusing on checkbox review, partly, and frankly, everybody on here probably knows a lot more about college admission than most of the justices on the court.
Mhm,
They
mhm.
probably think that that is a way that we do things now, that we look at an application, and if we look and see that somebody has checked that they are Black or African American or Hispanic, Latino, we look at everything else one way, and then we look at the other way if they're Asian American or white. That's not the way we do things. It's never been the way we've done things in all my 37 years in this business. But if you assume that's what we're doing and you take that away, and that's all you're saying, we're taking that away, then maybe the impacts are modest. I don't think they're zero, because there are lots of ways that somebody could be checking that box and that identity is authentic to their experience, but there's not a lot else that differentiates them in the application, because they don't, especially honestly, if you're a middle class African American student in a nice suburb of New York City or Chicago or Atlanta or Philadelphia, you may not think of your identity as a Black American as being an important part of what you have to represent for your college going. You've been taking hard classes, you've been earning good grades, you've been doing your activities. You're not necessarily seeing that the water that you swim in is in some way different. We do find that students, when they arrive on campuses where they're encountering a broader set of racial differences, do start to understand and reinterpret things in new ways. They encounter the microaggressions, they encounter all the politics of this, they learn and change a lot. And so you might not represent that on your application in a concrete way, even though it is fundamentally and ultimately a part of your identity that is important and might make a difference in your college experience.
But that, I mean, as we started talking about in the beginning, that's what higher education is all about, is to bring this diversity and these opportunities, and that lifts our whole society. And so are they trying to redefine the purpose of higher education?
No, and the two things stem from that. One is, I'll be clear that I don't know anybody in higher education that isn't committed to still doing that. Assembling diverse groups of people to learn and to solve problems is still going to be our mission no matter what. Really, the basis for this investigation is just about the question of whether race is a factor in life and experience in America, which is sort of a dumb question because we all know that it is. I don't think anybody would say, hey, it makes no difference in the world whether you're Black or white. It makes no difference in the United States. It's just that there's no reason to have any evidence that that's true. There are circumstances where it makes less of a difference, but that doesn't mean it makes no difference. So it in that sense, it's sort of an inversion of the 14th Amendment to sort of go from protecting people who were unprotected to now interpreting that people who have always been protected, white people, us, are now harmed. Which is a big leap, but it is a leap that this court might seem prepared to go. And many Americans feel like there's been evidence of that's accumulated over time. So I'm not in a position to render the fundamental answer on that. I will only say that to the extent that race does represent an important difference that students can bring to our processes and bring to our classrooms and bring to our dorms and our environments, we're still going to want to see that. We're still going to want to find that. We don't want to become a place that is either race exclusive or really cut exclusively based on socioeconomic status or any of the other things that, frankly, places like Cornell, we're always accused of doing that. It's like, oh, well, that's only for rich people, or that's always been historically for white people, which is not at all true for us. We had a founding mission that was entirely different than that. But, they might say that about Harvard, founded in 1636, and think they've got something to go on. But nobody at Harvard wants that. Nobody wants to be a place that's an enclave of exclusive white privilege. I don't think very many universities in the United States could survive if that was their fundamental intent. So we'll keep at it, but we will do it within the confines of whatever the law is and what this new court interprets it to be, at least until we have an opportunity to do something different, which I don't know when that will happen.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's hard to know. Who would have thought you would even be at this point in 2023? I was just, in so many ways it feels like we've just gone backwards with Roe v. Wade being overturned, the whole abortion issue, everything is just feels like we've gone backwards.
Well, the funny thing is, who did think we were going to be at this point in 2028 was Sandra Day O'Connor. So she wrote the majority opinion in 2003 and said, we understand the need for racial identification now in college admissions processes, but we want you to make it so that you don't have to use it in 25 years. And I'll confess that people like me and my entire ilk were not quick enough on the uptake. I said it at the time in 2003. I tried to say it many times ever since. We need to be fundamentally about changing high school education and what we prioritize in admissions and what we do on our college campuses so that we meet that 25-year standard. And I don't know anybody that would say we didn't. We basically failed that. We didn't convert enough of higher education in our processes rapidly enough to fit that expectation that she had laid out.
That's interesting. I had heard that, but I had forgotten about that. So the cases that are the foundation that have come before this particular case, one of the other ones was the University of Texas.
Yeah.
So how does that one differ from what's going on here?
Well, so Abigail Fisher, the plaintiff in that case, had said that she was denied admission to Texas on the basis of her being white and other students who were less qualified being Black and Latino, and she specifically challenged Texas at what at that time was Texas's 10% solution. So Texas came with not a unique but an uncommon approach. There's echoes of it in both Florida and California as well. But they said, look, we'll just say all the public schools in Texas all have a context, and if you reach the top 10% of that high school, and now I think they're down to 6 3/4, then we'll take you. One of the reasons that worked to help Texas stay at least somewhat more diverse at the University of Texas at Austin in particular is we're so segregated in our high schools. There's so many high schools that if they are Latino, they are 80% Latino. If they are Black, they're 80% Black or more. And so they were getting the best of these segregated environments in columns, all assembling and coming to Texas. But she said that practice was discriminatory. There wasn't really ever a lot of evidence on her side. And the court basically used that to refine what they expected, what they expected colleges to do in proving and demonstrating that they needed to use race and ethnic identity as part of what they have to do, and also to squeeze even more closely the process whereby they were supposed to review what they were doing and support what they were doing and define what they were doing more carefully. So in both of the Fisher cases, there was refinement and activity on that. But it didn't fundamentally change the calculus. What had happened in 2003 remained the core law of the land, that race was possible as part of a holistic review, as long as it was narrowly tailored and as long as race-neutral alternatives had been considered and pursued. And
so this applies equally to both public and private universities then.
The law, there's been laws within Michigan, within Florida, within Texas, within California, but the law in the Supreme Court case, Gratz and Grutter cases in 2003, and the law in both parts of the Fisher cases applied to everybody, private and public. This new finding, whatever it is, in the case of SFFA versus Harvard in North Carolina, will also apply in essence to everybody.
So one of the things that I noticed when they had the arguments in October is the discussion of diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how some of the Supreme Court justices didn't even know what that meant.
Well, one in particular used those exact words, like, I don't even know what that means, basically. So, there's a point in there somewhere, in the sense that if you say the word diversity, it doesn't render the exact same definition in the mind of everybody who hears it. I think there's probably a very large preponderance of people who understand that race is one of the ways that diversity manifests itself, as is gender, sexuality, class, income level. And then there's more invisible things, but that you can tease out in an admissions process or over time, as you know people, like how people think about things, their orientation towards lots of ideas, and even fundamental aspects of their character. These things vary. There are diversity of those things. So again, this is really just looking at one kind of diversity and saying we think that's an illegal use. But there will be many other kinds of things that continue to be important in the realm of diversity, no matter what the Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court says. It'll still be something that matters on college campuses and that they will continue to pursue.
But that lead us to leads me to the question of, well, then once they do race, then will it be some of these other things?
Oh, he was explicit about that. He said, maybe we need to take a look at all these other rulings and considerations we've had that seem to I can't remember exactly what it said, but that basically privileged people based on forms of diversity that are, in his mind, were maybe meaningless or were not constitutionally protected. So we'll see. There are others, many others, who've said race is probably the biggest hurdle and battle that's sitting there right now, and that's not accidental. We have a lot of political dialogue and a lot of policy dialogue around the question of race. The controversial about the 1619 project, some of the activities that have gone on down in Florida which seem to have a political intent, the whole battle school board by school board across the entire country about critical race theory. We're still relitigating the question of race in America, which makes it kind of crazy to say, oh, no, we're in a post-racial colorblind society. There's nothing but evidence that that's not true. But those who would assert that it is true, or in some way they're thinking idealistically they'd like it to be true, are having a moment. They're having an upper hand politically at this time.
Well, even this week, we just celebrated Martin Luther King's holiday, and so many people are listening to reports where, especially politicians, and particularly in Florida, and if we have any Florida people, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And hold on just a minute, Carmen. Looks like we are gathering questions here. But how people were taking the words from Martin Luther King, especially from his I Have a Dream speech, and saying, I'm looking forward to the time where my children are being judged by the quality of their character, not by the color of their skin, as his vision for the future, and a reason not to have race as part of all these different things. And yet that wasn't not what his message was at all. And
well, that was his I Have a Dream speech, and it's a great dream. It's just, like any other dream, you can't just will it into existence and pretend that it's there. You have to make it. You have to create it and make the grounds for it. And what people, I think, forget about Martin Luther King was he was quite the radical on some other things, especially questions of economic justice. And there's a lot about his visions and dreams that we've come nowhere close to just because he was successful in leading a movement to bring the civil rights era into a greater degree. That was not the end of the work. That was, in his mind, only the beginning of his work, and he died at 39 and couldn't keep going. But we're nowhere close to Martin Luther King's best dreams. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, Carmen, go ahead.
Okay, so there's two that I think go hand in hand. Do you think this could go so far as to forbid the collection of information about race at all? No checkbox, no demographics. And there has been a lot of speculation that if the court rules against the use of race, colleges will eliminate legacy preferences also. What are your thoughts on these?
Sure, I'll take the second one first. I think legacy is going to come under a lot of political pressure. It already is, but from the moment the decision is announced in June and July, I think it goes under another level of scrutiny. We're already having to think about it a lot here at Cornell because legacy is a part of who we are. Been around since 1865, and there's multiple generations of people who pull themselves all the way up the hill to this little city of Ithaca, and they want their children to have that same opportunity. It's hard to say that's a bad thing. It's something they want, and it's something they work hard to get. But legacy is under threat. There's other things under threat. Children of faculty who are still not as racially as diverse as we'd like. At least some of the athletic programs, in a high expense sport where it takes a lot of money to turn your kid into a fencer or a rower or whatever, that's on the block. Early decision, which seems to favor wealthier people. So all these things are, I think, subject to another round of scrutiny and review. They already work from the Varsity Blues scandal, but now even more so is, this is something that privileges white people. So if we're going to take away the privileges, if that's what you want to call them, for Black and Latino enrollment, then you need to take a long, hard look at that too. So I think that's a definite. And then Carmen, I'm sorry, the first part of the question was?
Do you think that this could be to go so far as to forbid the collection of information about race at all? No checkboxes, no demographics.
Yeah, I think that's the hard question. I think that's where those of you in counselor roles are going to come into play, because what we're seeing already now in anticipation of this ruling is more on school profiles, on various letters, in students' own essays and revelations. We're seeing more efforts to identify than we've ever seen before, because I think a lot of people thought the checkbox, the demographic checkbox, is doing the work for them. And in fact, it was maybe sort of polite and subtle to not draw attention to this, but know that the reader was going to see it. So they're going to see all the ways in which an African American or Latino applicant is incredible and the same and well qualified as every white or Asian applicant, but then notice with, some glee that, hey, not only are they, an incredible champion leader in every way, but they've done this being one of very few African Americans in a largely white high school, and these kind of things were true. So now that's assumed to be going away, which means we have to sort of be more explicit about drawing attention to our diverse communities on our school campuses, our diverse neighborhoods. I went to a high school, Grossmont High School in San Diego, that was probably 40% elite and predominantly white, probably now these days white and Asian American, and then 60% a more transient population living in less favorable economic circumstances in the valley in apartments. And that was always an important part of what that school was and its dynamics and who had access to AP classes and all this stuff. I think a Grossmont or something like it probably calls more deliberate attention to that now than they did before. But here's the question. The Supreme Court could do a lot of things that make that seem like that's chilled, that they're in other words, the intent of the law may be that that's just not something that I as a reader really have much opportunity to know about X or Y applicant. It's really weird because it gets into some mind think about how much I do or don't know or understand about particular communities and particular students and their circumstances and their behaviors. But that, and I some counselors may face this question about, am I honoring the letter of the law by still including this information in my profile or in the letter of recommendation specific to a student? Am I violating the intent of the law in doing that? And do I want to do that? Is that right to do for this student because it is really important to their identity? Well, it's not right to do for this other student because it doesn't seem particularly important to their identity. I think there's going to be more judgment available and more consequence coming available to the high school counselors than ever before about how they are representing and describing and counseling their students as they apply. So good luck to all that. From our standpoint, if the Supreme Court doesn't rule it out, we'd like to have that better information. It's really helpful to us in making good decisions, but we're not trying to encourage anybody to violate the law once that law is known and understood.
Well,
There is
go ahead, Carmen.
There is a couple of comments about the relationship between gender and race. I fail to understand the basis of the Supreme Court's concern with race-conscious admissions. If discrimination based on gender is against the law, but you can ask the gender of an applicant on the college application or infer it from the applicant's name. And if gender balance is a theory of begin institutional goal, why can't these same principles be used with respect to race?
Well, gender gets all kinds of complications. Number one, it's a very fluid concept for a larger fraction of people now, or at least they're identifying themselves in more fluidity and gender than ever before. I do not make any assumptions now about anybody. If I see them or I see their name, I do not say that I know their gender identity at all. And also, there are still single gendered institutions. So it's hard to sort of take a prop away from that, which is part of their charter and identity in this very critical way. The gender stuff has entirely different and big implications for us. Carmen, you mentioned, you're in a program of engineering, which, now is proud, I would assume, to have as many women as men or more. We've been working hard at that at Cornell for 5 or 6 years. We've been trying to make sure that access to engineering and computer science for women was a priority for us, to create programs, create identities and pipelines. So I think that is a reality. This suit is about race and ethnic identity, but that doesn't stop future lawsuits based on gender discrimination or the perception of it, or it doesn't really technically stop the court from ruling that gender is to be treated in a different way, even in their ruling right now. It depends on how intrusive they want to be with college admission. They might just narrowly consider the question in front of them, or they might be really expansive in their interpretation, as they were with Dobbs.
Well, years ago, and Bill brings this up in the chat, I see your comment, before we were trying to increase the number of women that were going to college, and now it's flipped. And so now we're trying to increase the number of males that are coming to college. So how has that been, and how would that be managed? I mean, you wouldn't be able to do that anymore either if you can't use gender in the decisions.
Well, to me, honestly, Cyndy, that highlights an important concept here, which is part of the response to this is going to be us rethinking, reconsidering, replanning what we do in college admission, college outreach, and still trying to be everything we want to be across questions of gender and race and many other forms of diversity. Part of this may be a broader societal change at an earlier level in people's lives. So in this country, we've tolerated property taxes dictating a lot of a student's high school experience. There's a wealthy school district within a mile of a very not wealthy school district, and it's a lie to say their experience is the same. They're different experiences. The teaching background and preparation and continuity is different, and there's so many things that attend that money question right next door to each other. So that may be a question that gets raised. What are we really providing for students at earlier levels? And maybe that ultimately gets conflated about what are we doing that expects people to have college degrees to do certain kinds of work. And that's changing a little bit, I think, in a healthy way. The state of Pennsylvania just said, there's a whole bunch of government jobs that don't require a degree. We'll look at experience. I think that's all for the good. We've been a little bit over credentialed, but you're still going to be looking at 70 candidates for a job. And if one of them's got a degree from a good university, you might think that's a better candidate, even if it's not required for that particular job. So college is still going to matter. And if women are accessing it in much larger numbers, which has been growing true over the last 15, 20 years, then I think we're going to have to ask the question about what are we doing to our boys? What are we doing to socialize them, to make them able to access this privilege of higher education or not? And are we satisfied with boys being more likely to successfully commit suicide, to be much more likely to go into the incarceration systems, to have a bigger, wider documented problems with violence and drugs and all kinds of things? Are we content that that's what our society is like? Or do we want to think better about what we're doing for girls and what we're doing for boys and making that more equal and supportive of people with these different gender identities? There's a whole lot of dialogue that I think stems after the Supreme Court's decision that we haven't even started to plumb yet.
Well, yeah, because I'm thinking of this program that I know up in Oakland that it's targeted African-American males so that they could go to college, and they're using sports. So we've got three factors right there that, all three could go away.
Yeah, I've always worked at highly selective universities, all three of the places I've worked. And historically, the share of African Americans and Latina students who were women has been close to 2/3 for a long time, and that's not going to go away in a hurry. But that's a problem that's been known prior to any Supreme Court intervention in my career, and we haven't done enough about it. We've not done nearly enough about it to try to address that problem.
So that leads to two other topics. And as you're talking about preparing our students, and that goes earlier. So the program I used to work in, and many of you've heard me talk about this, was AVID. And so we would start even as early as 6th grade, teaching the students how to take notes and doing Socratic method and tutorials and things like that. So 97% of the students coming out of program would go to college and be admitted, but 87% of them would stay. And that was the big number that was had so much implications and impact, because they were prepared to go to rigorous universities like Cornell and be able to compete and stay. And that doesn't happen if you start working in the senior year and just have an outreach program. You're not in the math, you're not in the science, you're not having the skills that you can be able to compete at that level. So yeah,
it's pretty clear to me that the earlier you start, at least down to about the 6th grade level, the more progress and success you have. And so the programs that have been most transformative and impactful, I think, go that deep. I think you can do meaningful work with students at 11th grade and even, in some ways at 12th grade to sort of get them at that final bell. But the earlier you start, the better.
Mm-hmm. So will any of this with the Supreme Court impact the programs at the universities to help the students, their math centers or English centers or things like that? Do you feel like they would have to be changed, or?
Yeah, it's a big debate on a campus like mine, because ostensibly you'd say, hey, there's value in, we got 70,000 applications for admission. We're picking 3,500 students. Engineering, other STEM fields say, well, pick the ones that have multivariate calculus and second year calculus and physics. And yes, we understand the value of bringing people at that sort of ground level of knowledge and that they've acquired. But we know that those classes aren't available at the large run of high schools. Even calculus isn't available at some huge fraction, maybe half of US high schools. So in saying we're going to do that, and we're going to, bring everybody in at the same level and take them from there, you're automatically being highly exclusive in a way that might disrupt all your other ways that you want to be an interesting, challenging environment for a wide set of people. It's, you're isolating people in their academic achievement belt. So that's the debate. What are our faculty here for? They're here to teach everybody and bring them from whatever level they can get, a certain high standard, but not necessarily the highest possible standard line you can draw, and bring them up and through and get them ready so that by the time they get to their junior year engineering courses, they're really caught up and going well? Or are we here to just skim the ultra richest part of the cream and put them to another level? And I hope that debate will resolve in the former, because when you look at what our founder said and what most institutions, frankly, say is their mission, not very many of them say we're here to take the best of the best and give them that last little finishing polish and that last little bit of spin. There's education that's like that, but that's not what these great research universities said they were designed to do. Or at least that's not where they've stayed in their mission or activity. So I hope you'll actually see a growth in colleges reaching out and providing more supportive platforming and education to get people to a certain level to then go on, maybe not all the way back to remedial and two-track kinds of systems and things that they can be very problematic on a college campus, as they often are on a high school campus. But more support, and maybe we'll use what we've learned about online education as another sort of prop for that. And that seems to me like that could be a great outcome of what we all have to do during COVID. It's like, let's use what we've learned to really bolster the opportunities for a wider swath of people and get them to be in a place like this ready to go.
Oh, that's so good to hear. I know in our AVID program, we purposely did not take the straight A students. Those were not the students where we wanted the B and the C students, because they were the ones who were committed and would do the work and put in the effort. And we saw great opportunity. And a lot of times parents would want their top A student in there, and we had to work to explain, like, no, that's your student will do just fine on their own. We're here to help and support these other students. So
all of this has to be rooted in, to me, something that's just obvious, but that people seem to forget all the time as they pursue their activities, is talent is evenly distributed. There are multiple kinds of talent and they are everywhere. Opportunity is what's different. So if you say we're going to work with the high achieving low income students at the high school level or at the college level, and I have a great admiration and connection to a lot of places that do exactly that, you shouldn't be at the same time saying that the low achieving low income students are therefore washed out and we're not going to do anything for them. You have to think about what you're doing for everybody, because the true genius of somebody's approach to something may not be evident because of their circumstances rather than their actual abilities. And if you give them those opportunities and shift their circumstances, they will often surprise you and do amazing things. Maybe not in an aggregate statistical measurement, but enough that we shouldn't be comfortable that somebody who's not done particularly well in high school is not somebody who's not going to do particularly well in life or make any huge and significant, incredible contributions. They very well may do that, and colleges should want to be part of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just lifts all of us up. It'll make an impact on not only just in the US, but throughout the whole world, and as people and counselors are looking at their students internationally, whether they're in China or Malaysia or wherever, they need to be able to they come and participate in that, and then they bring that back to their countries. And so that
reminds me, I think there's going to be a little squeeze on international students coming out of this, at least at those most selective 200 or 400 universities. If you're anxious about how well you're still crafting a class that represents the diversity within America, it doesn't mean you're not considering the diversity that comes from beyond the shores of America, from abroad, but it's a back burner issue for a while until you've settled all these other dimensions. So, and I've been involved in Africa and education for a long time now, 20 years, and it hurts my heart, the idea that but I think that's going to be the outcome. I think America is going to be a little inward looking for a little while in adjusting to this circumstance, and that's painful.
Yeah, yeah. So one other topic we haven't brought up yet is the testing. So, with COVID, we saw a distinct, drop off in terms of the requirements for standardized tests. And I know here in California, we went from requiring it to now it's test blind. You can't even take it and see it. And when that happened, some of the diversity increased because all of a sudden students weren't intimidated by having to take the test. And now some of that's coming back. So where do you see that in terms of impacting all of this?
So yeah, tests have always been a part of this. They've been part of every lawsuit that was brought that challenged these policies. And so it's the two things are bound together. I think we saw colleges and universities go to test optional in a hurry because of the pandemic health crisis, but they're staying there in big numbers in part because of this new information and trying to figure that out. In our experience at Cornell, the biggest phenomenon was first generation students. So here we had people who did not have a college going culture in their family to draw on, who were the most unhappy and disturbed about the effects of the tests, and they were the group most likely to respond to that opportunity. And I hope that goes on because it's great to have, us be engines of transformation for the first generation. It wasn't entirely a phenomenon of race and ethnic identity so much as it was first generation, which has a correlative bundle there. But I hope that persists in some way, shape, or form. And like the University of California, some of our colleges at Cornell did go score free. But I have to point out something because the United States has been kind of unique in having this SAT, ACT, these relatively generalized tests, not designed to measure specific classroom instruction, but designed to measure a set of skills that were supposed to come out of classroom instruction in some way. Most other places, they test what they taught. 90% of the tests in the world, the A-levels, the French baccalaureate, all these other systems, the Abitur, they all test what was taught in class. That's still germane in the University of California. It's still germane at Cornell. So if AP reflects that, or there's other we have Regents tests in California, if there's still tests that reflect, that's still in use. And my expectation is that might be understood to be more in use and more critical over time. So I don't think we're necessarily away from testing. I think we're away from a very particular kind of testing that has been used in the United States for a long time now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Go ahead, Carmen.
John, do you think that colleges will be asking more questions about identification and community on their applications to compensate?
Yeah, I just point to our neighbor down in New York City. As far as I can tell, and I think this is a matter of published record, so I'm not saying out of school, but I think NYU flipped from a test that was sort of above that type of, why do you want to go to NYU or why do you want to study what you want to study? I don't remember what it was before, but now they have this question about what are you bringing that enhances diversity to the NYU campus? I think you'll see a lot of that where you haven't seen it already. You'll see more of that. I don't know where it's going to go. The problem there that's been raised by faculty on my campus is, are you inviting students to compete on the basis of how much they are able to convince us that they've been deprived in some way, or that their identity has in some way inhibited their ability to be successful, or that it's hurt them in some way? Because we're not trying to create that what's called poverty porn and use those stories to say, look at the amazing thing we're doing. We're taking this kid who's half blind like me and comes from a single family home, and that we're not stepping all over that and sort of using that as a proxy value. So it's tough. It's tough to come up with the right kinds of questions that elicit answers that are really helpful in your process without then taking you too far in a direction you didn't intend. So I think we'll see a lot of experimentation around that, but I don't know where we'll finally land. And then, of course, we have to allow for the fact that probably a lot of these essays are now going to be answered through an interface with a chat GPT, and we'll get a lot of very similar sounding answers because that's what chat GPT tends to do. So
yeah, very formulaic and all of that. No.
There's another question. How could the expected decision impact HBCUs?
I confess I don't know for sure. And it'll be interesting to see if there's somehow some recognition of that in the Supreme Court's
Right.
Statement. The HBCUs obviously filed a brief, an amici brief on behalf of Harvard and UNC. So like every other higher education and lots of other institutions, the military, the Fortune 500 companies, they all don't want the Supreme Court to do this. Assuming the Supreme Court does do this, are they going to account for the historic critical value that HBCUs have brought since even before the Civil War to this country? I don't know. Tribal serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions.
Right.
I mean, what's so crazy about this is there's a huge number of programs administered by the federal government that are explicitly about higher education for students from certain ethnic and racial identities. So like the whole suite of TRIO programs, how do they do this? How do they get past all those things and sort of limit what people like me and people like me at 200 or 300 or 400 other campuses in the United States, they're going to tell us, you can't do this, but then it's being done in many important ways all over the place, including things that are massively funded by all of our tax dollars. It's going to be a crazy line that they're having to thread to get at something that seems reasonable. We'll see if they do it.
Do they not put that in part of the Supreme Court hearings and things that all the federal government programs are based on this?
I don't remember it. I'm certain that part about what the federal government supports, I'm certain that did not come up in oral arguments. I can't remember if anything came up about HBCUs from a defendant's counsel. Maybe. It's been a while since I listened to the whole tape.
Well, it just shows sometimes they're not looking at all the implications. It ends up.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd be willing to bet somebody $1,000. They're definitely not going to be, rendering a judgment that has looked through all the implications. It's not going to be that. It's not going to be that good. This is not going to be a judgment of intellectual vigor written for the ages. This is something that's coming out of a different place.
Yeah. So what can we do as we're getting close to our hour? What can we do as college advisors, as counselors, working with the families and the students? How can we help in this, John?
Well, I would just mention two things. One, I kind of already talked about, which is that I think every college counselor who in some way either helps a student represent themselves or in some way represents a student to college admissions is going to have to understand what the law is and figure out how they want to treat with it. In other words, if they've got a student in front of them whose identity as an African-American, Latino, or Native American, somebody of multiracial background, if that's important to their understanding and their students' understanding of who they are, and there is some latitude for how that might get revealed to college admissions offices, then they're going to have to decide whether or not they take that plunge and where they orient themselves to that particular question. And hopefully they still have the freedom to do that. Hopefully we're not talking about mind think interference at that very granular level. But the other thing is, please understand that this is what colleges still and always will want to do. I have a fear that many young students and their families are going to hear this decision and say, okay, places that were never really designed for me are even less for me, and sort of walk away from an incredible array of opportunities and resources. And that's insane in many ways. And yet, if college counselors don't step into that breach and say, no, Harvard may not be allowed to consider this aspect of who you are in the same explicit way as they did before, but Harvard still wants you just as much as ever. UNC wants you as much as ever. Cornell, University of California, Berkeley, they all want you as much as ever. And hopefully we're all out there saying that ourselves, but you see them every day and we see them once in a cycle. And so I think having faith and belief that is still going to matter to elite selected places and communicating that to your audience is going to be really critical.
That's key. Well, and that's something we will definitely do. You have lots and lots of voices out there that will, share that story. And from wherever we come from and all the kinds of students that we work with, we can definitely help with that. So thank you so much, John. This has just been so illuminating.
Thank you. I have a request. I didn't have a chance to follow the comments and the links. Is somebody, Carmen, maybe can you save that chat and send it to me in an email? I'd love to sort of catch up with some of the things that many people were saying, and if there's something that I need to further refine or explain myself, or if there's a challenge there, I love it. I welcome it, because we're all thinking through this stuff and nobody really knows all the answers, and the more challenges and dialogue we're having, the better. So I'd be very happy to see that and try to respond to it.
Okay, yeah, we'll send that to you. Diane put in that the Chronicle, and we'll put this in our show notes too, that the Chronicle's doing a 4-week series. So that's available. I guess people can sign up for that. So we'll look into that too.
Yeah, this is a good time to be doing this, because I think we want to be ready, but then we're going to have to do it all over again in August, September, and throughout the course of a year or two ahead, because there's going to be so much change and so many ramifications that we're going to have to work through. Either way, even if they minimally change things, we're going to have to give some thought to it. We always have. We had to do it in both the Fisher cases too.
And you're expecting this decision maybe to come down as late as June and then impact the future class? I mean, you will have already admitted the class.
Well, yeah, typically these big decisions come toward the end of June. There's even some people said it might be the first part of July. That's not guaranteed. They could come out with a decision tomorrow for all we know. So, being prepared for it. It'll obviously be too late to impact the decision-making about this class. One of the things that we have to be clear about is a student who hears the new law and thinks that they were somehow discriminated against has no reason they can't bring a lawsuit the day after the decision comes out and say, hey, you conducted a process that's not consistent with this finding of this court in law. So the court's going to have to either be explicit about this is something moving forward, or they're going to open up a massive can of opportunities. I'm sure some of you have family or spouses or yourselves are lawyers. Could be a busy time for lots and lots of class action lawsuits. That's just one of the realities here.
Well, we'll keep our hands on the pulse, but what a challenge what a time to be in higher education admissions. What a challenge you have on your plate to manage all this. We just get to work with the students.
Yeah, if we just had 5 more years, I'd have been pretty close to retirement. So
right. Well, thank you, John. Thank you again for your time. And thank you for everybody being here. We had over 50 people on the call, I think up to well over 60. So we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all for spending your time on this issue. I know it's nice to have people caring and looking into it.
And if they want to contact you and ask some questions, what would be the best way to do that?
Email's the best, because I organize everything through that. So burdick@cornell.edu. Okay,
perfect. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Join me in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking to Peter Van Buskirk, and he's going to talk about, our friend and colleague. He's going to be talking about the 5 elements of a best fit. So this came up in December when we were talking about financial aid, and I've invited Peter to come back. So we'll see him in 2 weeks. John, have a great
embodiment of gentle wisdom in our process. So that'll be great.
Oh, I love that term. I have not heard that. I love it. Absolutely. So, all right, everyone. We'll see you again. Have a great weekend. Thanks again, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.